Number 1. Ruby Franke, the family vlogger who tortured her own children. Ruby Franke built an empire on YouTube by sharing what appeared to be an idealized vision of family life, documenting her experiences raising 6 children in Utah through her channel 8 Passengers, which at its peak attracted millions of subscribers who tuned in regularly to watch carefully edited glimpses into the Franke family's daily routines, parenting decisions, holiday celebrations, and the seemingly perfect existence of a large Mormon family navigating the challenges and joys of raising children in the modern world. Beginning in 2015, Ruby and her then-husband Kevin Franke opened their home to the camera, creating content that presented Ruby as a no-nonsense mother who believed in strict parenting methods, natural consequences for children's misbehavior, and traditional family values that resonated with a particular segment of YouTube's family vlogging audience. Over the years, the channel accumulated over 2.5 million subscribers and generated substantial income through advertising revenue, sponsorships, and the parasocial relationships Ruby cultivated with viewers who saw her as a parenting authority and someone whose advice and methods they could trust and emulate in their own lives. The content evolved over time to include everything from morning routines and homeschooling updates to discussions of parenting philosophies and responses to viewers who questioned some of Ruby's stricter disciplinary approaches, which occasionally sparked controversy within the family vlogging community and among child development experts who watched the publicly available content with growing concern. Some viewers began noticing troubling patterns in the videos, including instances where Ruby described punishing her children in ways that seemed excessive or emotionally harmful, such as the time she explained that she had refused to bring lunch to her kindergarten-age daughter who had forgotten it at home, framing this as a teaching moment about responsibility despite the child's young age, or when she discussed taking away her son's bedroom for 7 months as a consequence for pranking his younger brother, requiring him to sleep on a beanbag in another room without access to his personal space or belongings. These incidents, while concerning to some observers, were generally defended by Ruby's supporters as examples of tough love and allowing children to experience natural consequences. And the controversies would periodically flare up in comment sections and parenting forums before fading as new content was posted and the channel continued to grow. By 2020, however, cracks were beginning to show more visibly in the facade Ruby had constructed, with her oldest daughter publicly distancing herself from the family and her estranged relationship with her parents becoming a topic of speculation among followers who noticed her absence from newer videos. Ruby's content began to shift away from traditional family vlogging toward more intensive focus on parenting advice and personal development, and she became increasingly involved with a life coach named Jody Hildebrandt, who ran a counseling service called Connections and promoted ideas about personal responsibility, emotional regulation, and what she described as distorted thinking patterns that needed to be corrected through intensive therapy and lifestyle changes. Ruby became not just a client of Hildebrandt's services, but essentially a business partner and devotee, frequently appearing in Connections content and adopting Hildebrandt's language and frameworks in her own videos, which grew increasingly focused on themes of repentance, accountability, and the need for radical honesty in relationships, even as her own marriage deteriorated and Kevin Franke eventually separated from Ruby, reportedly at the encouragement of Hildebrandt's counseling approach. In 2022, Ruby officially ended the 8 Passengers channel, stating that she needed to focus on healing her family and working more directly with Connections, and many of her remaining followers transitioned to watching her appearances in Hildebrandt's content and following updates through social media, though the overall audience had significantly decreased from the channel's peak years as controversies and family fractures became more public. Throughout this transition period, Ruby's 4 younger children remained in her custody, and unbeknownst to the shrinking audience still following her journey and the millions who had once watched her family vlogs, the strict parenting methods that had occasionally raised eyebrows in YouTube videos had escalated behind closed doors into systematic abuse and torture that would eventually result in criminal charges, imprisonment, and one of the most shocking falls from grace in YouTube family vlogging history. On August 30th, 2023, a 12-year-old boy climbed out of a window at Jody Hildebrandt's house in Ivins, Utah, and ran to a neighbor's home, asking for food and water, and when the neighbor opened the door, they were confronted with a child who was emaciated, covered in open wounds, and had duct tape around his ankles and wrists, clearly showing signs of severe malnourishment and physical abuse that prompted immediate calls to law enforcement and emergency medical services. The responding officers found the boy in such dire condition that he required immediate hospitalization, with doctors later documenting evidence of prolonged starvation, repeated physical abuse, and psychological torture that had left him in critical condition. And when police went to Hildebrandt's home to investigate, they found Ruby Franke's 10-year-old daughter in similar condition, also severely malnourished and showing signs of sustained abuse and neglect. Both children were immediately placed in state custody and received emergency medical treatment while investigators began piecing together the horrific reality of what had been happening behind the closed doors of what Ruby Franke had once portrayed as a home dedicated to proper child rearing and family values. The investigation revealed that Ruby had been living primarily at Jody Hildebrandt's house with her two youngest children, while her older children were either estranged from the family or staying with their father Kevin, who had been separated from Ruby and had limited information about the conditions in which his younger children were living, despite having previously expressed concerns to others about the increasingly extreme nature of Ruby's partnership with Hildebrandt. The abuse documented by investigators was systematic and prolonged, including forcing the children to perform physical labor in the Utah heat without adequate food or water, binding them with rope and duct tape, holding them underwater, denying them access to bathrooms and forcing them to soil themselves, kicking them while wearing boots, and subjecting them to constant psychological abuse that included telling them they were evil, possessed by demons, and deserved the punishment they were receiving as consequences for their supposed misbehavior and distorted thinking. The children had been isolated from friends, family members who might have intervened, and any outside contact that could have revealed their situation, with Ruby and Jody apparently believing that this extreme treatment was necessary to save the children from themselves and correct what they viewed as fundamental moral failings, a grotesque distortion of the parenting philosophies and therapeutic frameworks they had been promoting in their public-facing content. Medical examinations revealed the extent of the physical damage, with both children suffering from severe malnutrition that had stunted their growth and development, infected wounds from being bound and struck, and psychological trauma that would require extensive treatment and therapy to address, and child welfare experts who reviewed the case described it as one of the most severe instances of child abuse they had encountered, particularly given the calculated and sustained nature of the torture and the way Ruby and Jody had apparently reinforced each other's belief that their actions were justified and even necessary. Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt were arrested on August 30, 2023, and initially charged with 6 counts each of aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony in Utah that carries potential sentences of up to 15 years in prison per count. And as news of the arrests spread across social media and news outlets, millions of people who had once watched 8 Passengers videos or followed Ruby's journey into life coaching were horrified to learn the reality behind the parenting advice and family values she had been promoting for nearly a decade. The YouTube community responded with widespread condemnation, with family vlogging channels, commentary creators, and child advocacy organizations all discussing the case as an example of the dangers of family content creation, the lack of oversight in the industry, and the way platforms can inadvertently provide cover for abuse by allowing parents to craft carefully edited narratives that hide the reality of their children's lives. Former viewers came forward to share that they had reported concerning content from 8 Passengers videos to YouTube and Child Protective Services over the years, but had received responses indicating that the reports did not meet thresholds for intervention, raising questions about whether earlier action might have prevented the escalation to the severe abuse that was ultimately discovered. Kevin Franke, Ruby's estranged husband, publicly stated through his attorney that he had been kept in the dark about the extent of the abuse, and that he too had been manipulated by Jody Hildebrandt's influence over Ruby, though this statement was met with skepticism by some observers who questioned how he could have been unaware given his previous presence in the children's lives and the concerning patterns that had been visible even in the family's public content. As the legal process moved forward, prosecutors presented evidence to support all 6 counts against each defendant, with each count representing abuse against one of Ruby's children or abuse occurring on different occasions. And the strength of the evidence, combined with the horrific nature of the crimes and the public attention on the case, made it clear that both Ruby and Jody faced the likelihood of significant prison time if convicted at trial. In December 2023, rather than proceeding to trial, both Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt accepted plea agreements in which they each pleaded guilty to 4 counts of aggravated child abuse in exchange for prosecutors agreeing to drop the remaining charges. And in their statements to the court during the plea hearings, both women acknowledged their actions while also attempting to provide context about their beliefs and mental states, with Ruby specifically stating that she had been led to believe her behavior was necessary to help her children but now recognized the harm she had caused. The court proceedings included the reading of detailed factual basis statements that laid out the specific acts of abuse to which each defendant was pleading guilty, and the descriptions were so disturbing that they generated additional waves of public outrage and trauma among those following the case, particularly former viewers who had once admired Ruby's parenting or sent their own children to watch 8 Passengers content as examples of good family values. On February 20, 2024, Ruby Franke appeared before Judge John J. Walton in Utah's 5th District Court for sentencing, where prosecutors presented victim impact statements from Ruby's children describing the lasting trauma they had experienced and their feelings of betrayal by a mother who was supposed to protect them, and Ruby herself gave a statement in which she expressed remorse and claimed that her partnership with Jodi Hildebrandt had led her down a dark path that she now recognized as wrong, though she also attempted to shift some responsibility by characterizing herself as having been under Jodi's influence and manipulation. Judge Walton, clearly unmoved by attempts to minimize responsibility, sentenced Ruby Franke to 4 consecutive sentences of 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison, the maximum consecutive sentencing allowed under Utah law for the charges to which she had pleaded guilty, meaning Ruby would serve between 4 and 60 years depending on the determinations of the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole, though legal experts noted that she would likely serve a substantial portion of that sentence, given the severity of her crimes and the public nature of the case. Jodi Hildebrandt received an identical sentence during her own hearing, with the judge making clear that both women bore full responsibility for their choices and the devastating impact those choices had on vulnerable children in their care. The sentences were widely praised by child advocacy organizations and those who had been calling for accountability in the family vlogging industry, though some observers noted that even the maximum sentence seemed inadequate given the years of abuse the children had endured and the psychological damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives. In the aftermath of the sentencing, Ruby's 4 youngest children remained in state custody with plans being made for their long-term placement and the extensive therapy and support services they would need to recover from their ordeal, while her 2 oldest children, who were adults and had been estranged from Ruby before the abuse was discovered, spoke publicly about their relief that their younger siblings were finally safe and their own complicated feelings about the mother who had once featured them prominently in family vlogs before the relationship deteriorated. Kevin Franke filed for divorce and was working to rebuild relationships with his children while also facing his own reckoning with how much he had missed or ignored during his marriage to Ruby and his involvement with the 8 Passengers channel. YouTube permanently removed the 8 Passengers channel and all associated content, though archive copies and commentary videos discussing the case remained available and continued to generate views and discussion about the responsibility of platforms, viewers, and society at large in protecting children who appear in online content. The Ruby Franke case became a catalyst for renewed calls for regulation of family vlogging, with legislators in multiple states introducing bills that would require parents to set aside earnings for children who appear in monetized content, limit the hours children can be filmed, and create mechanisms for greater oversight of family content creators, though as of early 2025 most of these legislative efforts remained in various stages of consideration rather than having been enacted into law. Child psychologists and family law experts have used the case extensively in discussions about the dangers of commodifying family life, the way financial incentives can corrupt parenting decisions, and the particular risks that arise when parents who are already prone to authoritarian or abusive parenting styles gain platforms and audiences that reinforce their behavior rather than challenging it. The case has also prompted broader discussion within religious communities, particularly among members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, about how religious concepts of repentance, consequence, and authority can be distorted and weaponized by individuals who use theological language to justify abuse, and church leaders have had to explicitly distance the organization from the actions of Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt while also grappling with questions about whether certain cultural attitudes within Mormon communities might make members more vulnerable to the types of manipulation both women engaged in. As Ruby Franke sits in Utah State Prison serving what will likely be decades behind bars, her fall from YouTube fame to convicted child abuser stands as perhaps the most extreme example of how the platform can enable harm, how audiences can be complicit in normalizing concerning behavior when it is packaged as family values and parenting advice, and how the children who appear in family content are often the most vulnerable and least protected participants in the online ecosystem that generates billions of dollars in revenue for creators and platforms alike. with Ruby's victims serving as a tragic reminder that the smiling faces and carefully edited moments in family vlogs may hide realities that are the exact opposite of what creators want their audiences to believe. Number 2. Austin Jones. The singer who used fame to exploit minors. Austin Jones seemed to represent a YouTube success story that many aspiring musicians dreamed of achieving, building a career from his bedroom in Bloomingdale, Illinois, by posting covers of popular songs and original music that showcased his vocal abilities and attracted a dedicated following of primarily young female fans who were drawn to his boy-next-door image, his engaging personality, and the way he interacted with his audience through comments, social media, and the parasocial relationships that developed as his subscriber count grew into the hundreds of thousands. Starting his channel in 2007, when he was just a teenager himself, Jones cultivated an image as a relatable, friendly artist who genuinely cared about his fans, frequently responding to comments, creating personalized video messages for supporters, and maintaining an active presence across multiple social media platforms where fans could feel like they had direct access to him and were part of a community built around his music and personality. His covers of songs by artists like Justin Bieber, One Direction, and other pop acts popular with his demographic garnered millions of views. And he parlayed this online success into real-world opportunities including live performances, meet and greets, and collaborations with other YouTube musicians, all while continuing to grow his audience and establish himself as part of the first generation of musicians who built careers primarily through YouTube rather than traditional music industry channels. By his early 20s, Jones had accumulated over 540,000 subscribers and was earning income through advertising revenue, merchandise sales, and appearances, living the life of a minor celebrity within the YouTube ecosystem and enjoying the admiration and devotion of fans who attended his shows, bought his products, and defended him fiercely in online spaces whenever any criticism or controversy emerged. The first public indication that Austin Jones's relationship with his young fans might be inappropriate came in 2015, when a Tumblr post went viral alleging that Jones had been soliciting sexually explicit videos from underage fans, using his fame and the trust his fans placed in him to manipulate girls into creating content they might not otherwise have made and that could constitute child sexual abuse material under federal law. The post included screenshots of alleged conversations where Jones asked fans to create videos proving they were his biggest fans by twerking or performing other sexualized dances while saying his name and their age, specifically targeting girls who were 14, 15, and 16 years old and creating a situation where young fans who desperately wanted approval from someone they admired would comply with requests they might otherwise recognize as inappropriate. The allegations generated significant attention within the YouTube community and led to Jones being temporarily dropped from some scheduled performances. But Jones responded by posting a video on his channel acknowledging that he had made mistakes and engaged in inappropriate conversations when he was younger, but claiming that he had grown, changed, and learned from those errors, and that the allegations, while based on real interactions, were being exaggerated and taken out of context by people who wanted to damage his career. Many of his fans accepted this explanation and rallied around him, arguing that everyone makes mistakes when young and that Jones deserved a second chance. And while his reputation suffered and he lost some followers, he was able to continue his career, continue posting content, and continue building relationships with new fans who either were unaware of the 2015 allegations or chose to believe his characterization of the events as past mistakes from which he had moved on. What Jones's defenders and even many of his critics did not know at the time was that the 2015 allegations were not isolated past mistakes but rather part of an ongoing pattern of predatory behavior that Jones had not stopped despite the public exposure and the warnings he had received about the legal and ethical lines he was crossing. Behind the scenes, Jones continued to use his platform, his direct messages on social media, and his status as a figure of admiration to young fans to solicit sexually explicit videos from minors, employing tactics that demonstrated clear understanding that what he was doing was wrong and illegal, including asking victims to include their age in the videos he requested, telling them to delete their conversations after sending content, and exploiting the power dynamic between a famous creator and fans who felt special to have been personally noticed and contacted by someone they admired. Federal investigators with the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI began receiving tips about Jones's continued behavior, including from some of the victims themselves who had come to realize they had been manipulated and exploited, And over the course of an investigation that spanned months, agents documented multiple instances where Jones had used interstate communications to receive sexually explicit videos from minors, building a case that would eventually lead to federal charges, carrying the potential for decades in prison. On June 12, 2017, Austin Jones was arrested by federal agents at Chicago O'Hare International Airport as he was about to board a flight, charged with 2 counts of production of child pornography, charges that reflected the fact that by soliciting and receiving the videos from minors, Jones had caused those minors to produce child sexual abuse material in violation of federal law. The arrest shocked even those fans who had been aware of the 2015 allegations, as the new charges made clear that this was not ancient history or youthful indiscretion but rather recent, ongoing criminal conduct for which Jones now faced serious federal prosecution. The criminal complaint filed by federal prosecutors detailed the allegations against Jones with specificity that left little room for the ambiguity and plausible deniability that had characterized the 2015 controversy, describing how Jones had contacted multiple victims through Facebook, asked them to produce sexually explicit videos showing them twerking and exposing themselves while stating their age and his name, and received at least 25 such videos from a 14-year-old victim and at least 15 videos from a 15-year-old victim, with the complaint noting that Jones had specifically instructed the victims on what to include in the videos and had acknowledged their ages while continuing to request additional content. In the messages documented by investigators, Jones demonstrated clear awareness that what he was doing was both illegal and wrong, at one point telling a victim, "I shouldn't be talking to you," before nonetheless continuing to solicit explicit content, and in another instance acknowledging that the victim was underage while still requesting videos and telling her to delete their conversation to avoid creating evidence of their interactions. The calculated nature of Jones's behavior, the number of victims, and the clear evidence of his knowledge that he was exploiting minors and violating the law made it evident to observers that this was not a case of questionable judgment or poor boundaries, but rather deliberate predatory conduct by someone who used his fame as a tool to sexually exploit children who trusted him. Jones was released on bond with strict conditions including electronic monitoring, prohibition on contact with minors, and surrender of his passport, and as he awaited trial, additional victims came forward to investigators and to the public, with some posting their own accounts on social media describing how Jones had manipulated them into creating explicit content by making them feel special, telling them they could prove their devotion to him, and exploiting their youth and the parasocial relationships he had cultivated through his YouTube presence. The YouTube community responded to Jones's arrest with widespread condemnation, with many creators who work with younger audiences discussing the responsibility that comes with having influence over fans and the particular vulnerability of minors in online spaces where they may feel they have personal relationships with creators they have never actually met. In March 2019, rather than proceeding to trial where prosecutors were prepared to present evidence from multiple victims and demonstrate a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years, Austin Jones pleaded guilty to 1 count of production of child pornography as part of a plea agreement in which prosecutors dismissed the 2nd count but reserved the right to argue for a significant sentence within the statutory range of 15 to 30 years in federal prison. During the plea hearing in United States District Court, Jones admitted to the conduct described in the criminal complaint, acknowledging that he had used interstate communications to persuade and induce minors to engage in sexually explicit conduct for the purpose of producing visual depictions of that conduct, the legal definition of the crime to which he was pleading guilty. The guilty plea represented a moment of accountability but also sparked debate about whether a plea agreement was appropriate given the number of victims and the calculated nature of Jones's conduct, with some victims and their families expressing frustration that Jones would not face trial and the possibility of even longer sentences on multiple counts. In August 2019, Austin Jones appeared before Judge John Z. Lee for sentencing, a hearing that included testimony and statements from some of his victims describing the lasting impact of his exploitation, the way they had struggled with shame and self-blame despite being children when Jones manipulated them, and their anger at how he had used something they loved, his music and online presence, as a weapon against them. Prosecutors argued for a sentence at the high end of the guideline range, emphasizing the number of victims, the amount of child sexual abuse material Jones had caused to be produced, and the particular breach of trust involved when someone with a platform and influence over young people uses that position to harm the very individuals who support their career. Jones's defense attorneys argued for a sentence at the lower end of the range, presenting Jones as someone who had struggled with sex addiction and poor impulse control, who had sought therapy and treatment, and who had shown remorse for his actions, though these arguments were undercut by the evidence that Jones had continued his predatory behavior even after the 2015 public allegations and the opportunities he had been given to change his conduct. Judge Lee, in announcing the sentence, noted the seriousness of Jones's crimes and the impact on his victims, stating that Jones had violated the trust of vulnerable young fans and had demonstrated a pattern of behavior that required significant punishment to protect the public and to reflect the gravity of his offenses. The court sentenced Austin Jones to 10 years in federal prison, a sentence that fell roughly in the middle of the statutory range, and that would be followed by supervised release during which Jones would be required to register as a sex offender, comply with restrictions on internet usage and contact with minors, and undergo treatment for sex offending behavior. The sentence was met with mixed reactions, with some victims and advocates arguing that 10 years was insufficient given the number of victims and the lasting harm Jones had caused, while others noted that the sentence was substantial and would result in Jones spending a significant portion of his 20s and early 30s in federal custody, effectively ending any possibility of returning to the music career he had built and ensuring that his name would be permanently associated with his crimes rather than his artistic work. Jones is currently serving his sentence in federal prison, with a projected release date in the mid-2020s assuming credit for good behavior, and upon release he will face the lifetime requirement to register as a sex offender in any jurisdiction where he resides, a designation that will restrict his employment opportunities, housing options, and ability to be in spaces where children are present. His YouTube channel was permanently terminated, his music removed from major streaming platforms, and his online presence effectively erased, with the archive of his work existing now primarily in the context of true crime discussions and educational content about the dangers of parasocial relationships and the exploitation of minors by online creators. The Austin Jones case has been studied by law enforcement, child safety organizations, and platforms as an example of how fame and access can be weaponized by predators, how the trust that develops between creators and fans can create vulnerability, and how the initial warning signs of inappropriate behavior, if not taken seriously and acted upon decisively, can allow predatory conduct to continue and expand. YouTube and other platforms have pointed to the Jones case as part of their justification for implementing stricter policies around creators who work with younger audiences, including restrictions on certain types of interactions, requirements for supervision during events involving minors, and more aggressive enforcement against creators who violate policies designed to protect children, though critics argue that these measures remain inadequate and that platforms have financial disincentives to thoroughly police creator behavior until that behavior becomes so egregious and public that ignoring it would create reputational damage to the platform itself. Child psychologists and victim advocates have used the Jones case to educate parents and young people about the dynamics of grooming, the way that predators identify and exploit vulnerabilities, and the particular risks that exist in online spaces where children may have contact with adults they admire but do not actually know, emphasizing that the parasocial relationships created through platforms like YouTube can give predators tools of manipulation that might not exist in traditional offline contexts. The victims in the Austin Jones case, some of whom have chosen to speak publicly about their experiences while others have maintained their privacy, represent the real cost of Jones's criminal conduct. Young people whose trust was betrayed, whose developing sexuality was exploited for the gratification of someone who saw them not as individuals deserving respect but as opportunities to fulfill his own desires, and who now must navigate the trauma of those experiences while also coping with the public nature of the case and the reality that the videos Jones solicited may continue to exist and circulate despite efforts to remove child sexual abuse material from the internet. As Austin Jones sits in federal prison, his transformation from YouTube star to convicted sex offender serves as a cautionary tale about the darkest possibilities of internet fame, the responsibility that comes with influence over young people, and the way that platforms designed to democratize content creation and connect creators with audiences can also create opportunities for exploitation and harm when individuals with predatory inclinations gain access to vulnerable populations who see them as trustworthy figures worthy of admiration and devotion. Number 3, Davi Vanity. The scene king who dodged justice for years. Jesus David Torres, known professionally as Davi Vanity, built a controversial career as the frontman of the electronic music duo Blood on the Dance Floor, a band that gained popularity in the late 2000s and early 2010s within the scene music subculture, attracting a primarily young female fanbase drawn to the group's high-energy performances, provocative lyrics, and the aesthetic of brightly colored hair, heavy makeup, and rebellion against mainstream culture that Davi embodied as the band's visible face and primary songwriter. From the beginning, Blood on the Dance Floor existed in a space of controversy, with critics condemning their music as low quality and their lyrics as inappropriate for their largely underage audience, but defenders arguing that the band represented authentic expression and that the pearl-clutching about sexual content was overblown moralizing that ignored the agency of young fans to consume content they found meaningful. Davi cultivated a persona as someone who understood the outsider experience of his fans, positioning himself as a fellow misfit who had created a community where young people who felt rejected or misunderstood could find acceptance. And this message resonated strongly enough that Blood on the Dance Floor developed a cult following that allowed the band to tour extensively, sell merchandise, and build a sustainable, if not mainstream, career through the early 2010s. Behind this carefully constructed image of an artist who cared about his young fans and provided them with a sense of belonging, Davi Vanity was, according to dozens of allegations that emerged over more than a decade, using his fame and access to systematically sexually assault, abuse, and exploit underage girls who came to his shows, participated in meet and greets, or were selected to spend time with him after performances. The first public allegations against Davi appeared as early as 2009, when former fans and associates began posting on social media and early call-out culture platforms about concerning interactions they or people they knew had experienced with Davi, describing incidents where he had initiated sexual contact with girls who were clearly underage, used his position to pressure fans into sexual situations, and created an environment around his tours where access to him was implicitly or explicitly connected to sexual availability from young female fans who were often between 13 and 17 years old. These early allegations were often dismissed or ignored by the broader music community and even by other fans of Blood on the Dance Floor, with Davi's supporters arguing that the claims were from jealous ex-fans, people trying to get attention, or individuals who regretted consensual experiences and were recharacterizing them as assault after the fact, and Davi himself denied any wrongdoing while continuing to tour and release music with minimal professional consequences despite the growing number of accusers sharing remarkably consistent stories. In 2009, Jesse Slaughter, whose real name is Damian Leonhardt, became one of the most visible early accusers when, at age 11, they posted videos online alleging that Davi had sexually assaulted them and subsequently faced severe cyberbullying and online harassment that became its own viral story and overshadowed the actual allegations against Davi, with much of the internet focusing on mocking the child's emotional videos and the infamous response from Jesse's father rather than investigating the serious claims being made about an adult musician sexually assaulting an 11-year-old. This pattern would repeat itself over the years, with accusers coming forward, sharing their experiences, and then facing harassment, disbelief, and dismissal from parts of Davi's fanbase and the broader internet community while Davi continued his career largely unimpeded, demonstrating the difficulties that victims of abuse by famous individuals face when trying to hold their abusers accountable, particularly when those victims are young, female, and part of subcultures that mainstream society already looks down upon or dismisses. Throughout the 2010s, as social media platforms evolved and online discourse about sexual abuse and power dynamics became more sophisticated, more survivors came forward with allegations against Davi Vanity, describing a consistent pattern where he would identify young fans at shows or through social media, initiate contact that made them feel special and chosen, isolate them from friends or other adults who might intervene, and then sexually assault them, often while they were intoxicated or in situations where they felt they could not refuse or report what was happening without risking their standing in the fan community or facing retaliation from Davi's more devoted followers. Some survivors described being assaulted on tour buses after shows, others in hotel rooms where they had been invited to hang out with the band, and still others in situations where Davi had specifically sought out fans he knew were underage, asked them to lie about their age or hide the interaction from parents and authorities, and used the power dynamic between a famous musician and a teenage fan to coerce compliance with sexual acts the survivors described as clearly non-consensual and, in many cases, criminal sexual assault of a minor under any reasonable interpretation of the law. The accumulation of allegations, the consistency of the patterns described, and the young ages of many accusers led to increasing pressure on venues, promoters, and the few remaining industry figures associated with blood on the dance floor to cut ties with Davi. And while some did distance themselves or cancel bookings, others continued working with him, citing the lack of criminal charges or convictions and arguing that they could not make business decisions based on allegations alone, no matter how numerous or credible those allegations appeared. In 2018, Chris Hansen, the television journalist famous for the To Catch a Predator series, began investigating Davi Vanity for a new project focused on YouTubers and online personalities accused of exploiting minors, and Hansen's involvement brought renewed mainstream attention to the allegations and provided a platform for multiple survivors to share their stories in recorded interviews that were subsequently released to the public. The Hansen investigation included over 20 accusers ranging in age from 12 to 17 at the time of their alleged assaults, with their accounts spanning from 2009 to 2015 and describing behavior that, if proven in court, would constitute multiple counts of rape, sexual battery, statutory rape, and sexual abuse of minors across multiple states. Hansen coordinated with law enforcement in several jurisdictions to provide the information gathered during his investigation, and prosecutors in multiple states indicated they were reviewing the evidence and considering whether charges could be brought, though they also noted the challenges of prosecuting cases where the alleged crimes occurred years or even a decade earlier, where physical evidence may no longer exist, and where the credibility determinations would rest primarily on the testimony of victims recounting traumatic experiences from their teenage years. Despite the volume of allegations, the media attention, Hansen's investigation, and the fact that multiple law enforcement agencies were reportedly examining potential criminal charges, as of early 2025, Davi Vanity has not been arrested or criminally charged in connection with any of the sexual abuse allegations that have been made against him by dozens of women describing experiences when they were minors. This absence of criminal accountability has been a source of frustration and trauma for survivors who have come forward publicly, subjected themselves to scrutiny and harassment, and cooperated with investigations, only to see years pass without the prosecution they believe is warranted by the evidence and the number of victims describing similar patterns of predatory behavior. Legal experts who have followed the case have noted several factors that may explain the lack of charges despite what appears from the outside to be overwhelming evidence of criminal conduct, including the challenges of prosecuting historic sexual abuse cases where evidence beyond victim testimony may be limited, the difficulty of proving lack of consent in cases where defense attorneys will argue the encounters were consensual even if the victims were legally unable to consent due to age, the resources required to build and prosecute complex multi-victim cases against defendants who have means to hire vigorous legal defense, and potentially the low priority that some prosecutor offices assign to cases involving victims from marginalized communities or alternative subcultures. Additionally, the interstate nature of many of the alleged offenses creates jurisdictional complications, as an assault that occurred in one state during a tour stop involves a victim who may now live in another state and a defendant who resides in yet another location, requiring coordination between law enforcement agencies and prosecutor offices that may have different priorities and resources available. Davi's career, while significantly diminished from its peak, did not immediately end despite the allegations and the Hansen investigation, with some tour dates continuing into 2018 and beyond, though venues increasingly refused bookings and the remaining fanbase shrank to a small core of individuals who either disbelieved the allegations or did not consider them disqualifying. Blood on the Dance Floor officially disbanded in 2016, though Davi continued performing and releasing music under his own name and attempted comebacks, most of which were met with protests, venue cancellations, and renewed attention to the allegations that have followed him throughout his career. The fact that Davi Vanity has maintained any ability to perform publicly or interact with potential fans, particularly young fans, despite dozens of detailed allegations of sexual abuse of minors, has been cited by advocates as an example of how systems designed to protect children often fail when the accused has fame, when the victims are marginalized or not believed, and when the legal standards for prosecution create barriers that allow predators to escape accountability even when their behavior is widely known and credibly reported. In 2021, Damian Leonhardt, the former Jesse Slaughter who had been one of the earliest public accusers in 2009, spoke again about the experience of being dismissed and harassed as a child trying to report abuse and about the trauma of watching Davi continue his life and career while the 11-year-old who accused him had to deal with becoming an internet meme and facing years of harassment that compounded the original trauma of the alleged assault. Other survivors have similarly described the secondary victimization of coming forward publicly, being disbelieved or attacked, and then watching as nothing happens to their accused abuser despite their courage in speaking out, and some have expressed regret about coming forward publicly given the personal cost and the apparent lack of meaningful consequences for Davi. The case of Davi Vanity is often discussed alongside other instances where allegations against men with fame and platforms have taken years or even decades to result in accountability, and where the burden placed on victims to repeatedly tell their stories, face scrutiny, and wait for justice systems to act creates additional trauma on top of the original abuse. Youth advocacy organizations have used the Davi Vanity case in educational materials about grooming, about the tactics predators use to identify and isolate victims, and about the particular vulnerabilities that exist for young people in fan communities where access to famous individuals can be presented as a reward or privilege that victims fear losing if they report abuse or resist advances. The music industry's response to the allegations against Davi has been criticized as inadequate, with calls for more systematic approaches to vetting artists who work with young audiences, creating reporting mechanisms for abuse that do not rely entirely on victims coming forward publicly, and ensuring that venues, promoters, and labels have policies that prevent known predators from accessing vulnerable populations even in the absence of criminal convictions. Some jurisdictions have pointed to the Davi Vanity case as evidence supporting the need for longer or eliminated statutes of limitation for sexual abuse of minors, arguing that the current time limits on prosecution can allow predators to escape accountability simply by avoiding detection or prosecution until enough time passes that charges can no longer be brought, regardless of the strength of evidence or the number of victims. As of 2025, Davi Vanity remains free, not subject to registration as a sex offender, and technically able to perform and interact with fans, though his ability to book shows has been severely limited by the reputational damage from the allegations and the activism of survivors and their supporters who protest any attempts at comeback performances. The lack of criminal charges or prison time in his case, despite the volume and consistency of allegations, serves as a stark reminder that the YouTube-to-prison pipeline that has captured other creators on this list is not inevitable, that some individuals accused of serious crimes continue to avoid legal accountability even when their alleged behavior is widely publicized and thoroughly documented, and that the systems designed to protect children and prosecute those who harm them have significant limitations that can leave survivors without justice and predators without consequence, a reality that advocates continue working to change through legal reform, cultural shifts in how allegations are received and investigated, and efforts to create alternative forms of accountability when traditional prosecution fails to materialize. Number 4. Onision. The manipulator who built a cult of personality Gregory James Daniel, known online as Onision, built one of YouTube's most controversial empires over more than a decade, accumulating millions of subscribers across multiple channels through a combination of comedy sketches, music videos, commentary content, and deeply personal vlogs that blurred the lines between performance and reality, creating a persona that was simultaneously self-aware and narcissistic, vulnerable and manipulative, entertaining and deeply disturbing depending on which aspect of his content viewers chose to focus on at any given time. Starting his YouTube career in 2006, Onision became known for viral videos including I'm a Banana and various comedic characters, but as his audience grew and his content evolved, he increasingly focused on creating videos about his personal life, his relationships, his conflicts with other creators, and his opinions on everything from vegetarianism to body image to the moral failings he perceived in others, often presenting himself as a brutally honest truth-teller willing to say what others wouldn't, while simultaneously demonstrating patterns of behavior that critics and eventually law enforcement would identify as grooming, manipulation, and psychological abuse, primarily targeting young women and girls who came into his orbit through his online presence. Throughout the 2010s, Onision's personal relationships became increasingly central to his content and increasingly controversial to observers, with a pattern emerging where he would begin relationships with fans who were significantly younger than him, often barely legal or in some cases not yet legal when initial contact occurred, bring these partners into his home and his content, create videos discussing intimate details of the relationships and any conflicts that arose, and then when relationships ended, create extensive content attacking his ex-partners, sharing private information about them, and encouraging his audience to harass these women while he moved on to the next young fan who would become his romantic and creative partner. The most significant and ultimately legally consequential of these relationships involved Kai Avero, whose legal name is Lucas Jackson and who went by Lanybot online, whom Onision began communicating with when Kai was 16 years old and Onision was in his mid-20s, with the two eventually entering a relationship that would last years and produce 2 children, and would become the center of allegations that would ultimately lead to federal investigations and the destruction of Onision's YouTube career. Kai, who began a social media presence and YouTube channel while in a relationship with Onision, eventually came out as transgender and went by they/them pronouns, though throughout the relationship Onision's treatment of Kai in videos and social media posts demonstrated patterns that domestic violence experts would later identify as classic emotional abuse, including public humiliation, isolation from friends and family, control over Kai's appearance and behavior, and using their platform to make Kai dependent on Onision both emotionally and financially while undermining their self-esteem and autonomy. As Onision and Kai's relationship continued, a disturbing pattern emerged where young women, often teenagers or barely legal adults, would be brought into their home in Washington state under various pretexts, including offering to help them escape difficult family situations, providing a place for fans to stay while visiting, or in some cases entering into polyamorous relationships with both Onision and Kai, and multiple women who had these experiences later came forward describing situations where they felt groomed, manipulated, sexually coerced, and in some cases assaulted, with the power dynamics of being young fans in the home of creators they admired making it difficult to resist pressure or recognize the problematic nature of what was happening until after they had left the situation. Sarah, one of the most prominent individuals to come forward with allegations, described how she had been a fan of Onision and Kai's content as a young teenager, began communicating with them online, and was eventually invited to live with them when she was 16 years old under the stated purpose of serving as a nanny for their children, though she later described this as a grooming situation where inappropriate boundaries were crossed from the beginning, where she was isolated from outside support systems, and where by the time she turned 18, Onision and Kai initiated a sexual relationship with her that she later characterized as coercive and as the culmination of years of manipulation that had been designed to lead to exactly that outcome. Sarah and other women who had similar experiences began speaking publicly about their time with Onision and Kai in 2019, sharing detailed accounts, text message screenshots, and in some cases recordings of conversations that painted a picture of a household where young, vulnerable women were systematically targeted, brought into proximity with Onision and Kai, subjected to psychological manipulation and boundary violations, and then either entered into sexual relationships they felt unable to refuse or were discarded and publicly attacked if they resisted or questioned what was happening. The allegations included claims that Kai had sent sexually explicit images to Sarah when Sarah was underage, that Onision had made sexual comments and advances toward other minors who had been brought into their home, that both Onision and Kai had created an environment designed to break down the boundaries and resistance of young women to make them sexually available, and that the pattern had repeated across multiple victims over a period of years, with Onision's YouTube platform serving as the mechanism through which vulnerable young fans were identified and targeted. As these allegations circulated widely on social media and were covered by numerous YouTube commentary channels, law enforcement began taking interest in Onision and Kai's conduct, with the FBI and local police in Pierce County, Washington, both opening investigations into potential crimes including solicitation of child pornography, sexual exploitation of minors, and other offenses that might apply to the behavior being described by multiple accusers. In January 2020, Chris Hansen, who had previously investigated Davi Vanity and other online predators, began a series of interviews with women who had experiences with Onision and Kai, providing them a platform to share their stories in detail and working to coordinate with law enforcement agencies investigating the case, bringing mainstream media attention to allegations that had been circulating in YouTube drama circles for months but had not yet received broader public scrutiny. Hansen's involvement and the mounting allegations led to a significant erosion of Onision's remaining support, with sponsors dropping him, YouTube demonetizing his channels, and his subscriber counts declining as more people became aware of the accusations and the patterns of behavior being described by multiple independent sources who had no apparent motive to fabricate such similar stories. In August 2020, the Pierce County Sheriff's Department executed a search warrant at the home Onision and Kai shared in Washington, seizing electronic devices and other potential evidence as part of an ongoing investigation into allegations of sex crimes involving minors. And while the specific focus of the investigation was not publicly disclosed in detail, the search warrant's execution represented a significant escalation in the law enforcement response to the allegations and suggested that investigators believed they had probable cause to believe evidence of crimes would be found at the residence. The execution of the search warrant was filmed by local news crews and generated significant coverage, with Onision subsequently posting videos responding to the search and maintaining his innocence, claiming that he had done nothing wrong and that the allegations against him and Kai were lies being spread by disgruntled ex-partners and people seeking attention or revenge for perceived slights. In the years since the search warrant execution, Onision's career has been effectively destroyed, with his YouTube channels demonetized, his ability to create content severely limited by platform policies, and his lack of sponsorship or income from the platform, and his reputation so thoroughly damaged that even his most loyal remaining fans have had difficulty defending him against the weight of allegations and the number of independent accusers sharing consistent stories about manipulation, grooming, and abuse. However, despite the FBI investigation, the local law enforcement investigation, the execution of a search warrant, and the public nature of the allegations made by multiple women, neither Onision nor Kai have been criminally charged as of early 2025, creating a situation similar to the Davi Vanity case where alleged predatory behavior is widely known, has been investigated by authorities, and involves multiple accusers describing criminal conduct, yet has not resulted in prosecution or incarceration. The reasons for the lack of charges in Onision's case are not entirely clear from public information, though legal observers have speculated about several possibilities, including challenges in proving the specific elements of federal crimes like production of child pornography, when the images in question may have been deleted or may exist in a legal gray area, difficulties in getting victims to cooperate with prosecution when doing so would require them to testify in court and be subjected to defense attorney cross-examination about traumatic experiences, the possibility that statute of limitations issues may apply to some of the alleged conduct, and the reality that investigations of this complexity can take years and may still be ongoing even when public attention has moved on to other stories. Kai has largely disappeared from public view, with their YouTube channel abandoned and their social media presence eliminated. And while they have not been charged with crimes, they also have not publicly addressed the allegations beyond Onision's statements defending both of them. Onision continues to maintain a minimal online presence, posting occasionally to drastically reduced audiences and continuing to deny wrongdoing, while also engaging in behavior that mental health professionals observing his content have suggested may indicate narcissistic personality disorder, including an inability to accept criticism, a pattern of blaming others for the consequences of his own actions, and a persistent belief that he is the victim of coordinated attacks rather than someone facing appropriate accountability for harmful behavior. The case has been extensively analyzed by psychologists, domestic violence experts, and those who study online manipulation and cult-like dynamics, with many noting that Onision's ability to create an insular community around himself, to convince young people that he offered them something valuable or special, and to systematically isolate and manipulate those who came into his sphere of influence demonstrates patterns common to cult leaders and abusers who use charisma and perceived authority to control others. The women who came forward about their experiences with Onision and Kai have faced harassment from his remaining supporters, have dealt with the trauma of publicly discussing their experiences, and have had to cope with the frustration of seeing years pass without criminal charges being filed, though many have said they do not regret speaking out because it has prevented Onision from continuing to easily target new victims and has warned potential future targets about the danger of getting involved with him. The lack of criminal accountability in Onision's case, despite what appears to be substantial evidence and multiple accusers, has led to discussions about the limitations of the criminal justice system in addressing grooming and psychological abuse, particularly when victims are legally adults even if barely so, when the manipulation is primarily emotional rather than physical, and when the power dynamics at play are based on fame and parasocial relationships rather than traditional forms of coercion that the law more readily recognizes. Youth protection advocates have used the Onision case to discuss the particular vulnerabilities of young people who are fans of online creators, the way that invitation into a creator's personal life can be used as a grooming tactic, and the importance of maintaining boundaries even when someone you admire online seems to be offering friendship, mentorship, or romantic attention. Platform accountability has also been a major theme in discussions of the Onision case, with critics arguing that YouTube allowed someone with a documented pattern of predatory behavior to continue operating on their platform for years, continued to recommend his content to young viewers, and only took significant action like demonetization after the behavior became so publicly known and controversial that continuing to support the channel would have created public relations problems for the platform, suggesting that platforms prioritize their own interests and public image over proactive protection of users who might be targeted by predatory creators. As Onision exists in a kind of limbo, neither fully held accountable through criminal prosecution nor able to rebuild the career and influence he once had. His case represents the complicated reality that falling from YouTube fame does not always mean going to prison, that investigations do not always result in charges even when there appears to be significant evidence, and that some creators who allegedly cause serious harm may face professional and reputational consequences without ever facing criminal consequences, leaving victims without the justice they sought and raising ongoing questions about what accountability means when traditional prosecution does not occur and whether the court of public opinion and platform enforcement can serve as adequate substitutes for the criminal justice system when that system fails to act. Number 5. Sam Pepper. The prankster whose jokes crossed into Assault Sam Pepper seemed to epitomize a particular strain of YouTube content that dominated the mid-2010s, where prank videos blurred the lines between harmless jokes and genuine harassment, assault, and cruelty dressed up as entertainment for millions of viewers who either didn't recognize or didn't care about the harm being inflicted on the unwitting participants who became targets of pranks that often involved physical contact, sexual harassment, fear, humiliation, or violation of consent, all in service of generating views, engagement, and revenue for creators who built careers on pushing boundaries and defending their content as just jokes whenever criticism emerged. Starting his YouTube career in 2010 after gaining some fame on the UK reality show Big Brother, Pepper quickly grew his channel by creating prank videos that often involved approaching strangers, particularly women, in public spaces and engaging in behavior that ranged from mildly inappropriate to clearly criminal, including groping, false kidnapping scenarios, and situations designed to frighten or confuse targets for the entertainment of viewers watching the edited final product that turned real people's distress into content. By 2014, Pepper had accumulated over 2 million subscribers and was part of a broader community of prank channels that collaborated, appeared in each other's videos, and collectively pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable on YouTube, with the platform's policies struggling to keep pace with content that technically violated rules against harassment and harmful or dangerous content but was defended by creators and their fans as comedy that was being taken too seriously by critics who didn't understand internet culture or appreciate edgy humor. In September 2014, Pepper posted a video titled "Fake Hand S Pinch Prank," in which he appeared to approach women in public, ask them for directions or engage them in conversation, and while they were distracted, reach out with what appeared to be his hand to pinch their buttocks, with the women reacting with shock, anger, and discomfort that was presented as humorous in the video's editing and framing, though the video also claimed to include a reveal that Pepper had used a fake prosthetic arm to do the pinching rather than his actual hand, supposedly making the prank less objectionable though still involving non-consensual touching of women's bodies for entertainment purposes. The video generated immediate and intense backlash, not just from the usual critics of prank content but from across the YouTube community, including other creators, women's advocacy organizations, and viewers who recognized that regardless of whether Pepper used a real or fake hand, the video depicted sexual assault of multiple women who had not consented to being touched, who had not consented to being filmed, and who were being presented as the butt of a joke for the crime of existing in public space where Pepper decided to target them. The controversy intensified when multiple women came forward on social media alleging that Sam Pepper had sexually assaulted them in private interactions separate from his public prank videos, describing situations where Pepper had used his YouTube fame to meet young female fans, had initiated unwanted sexual contact, and had in some cases forced himself on women who had clearly communicated lack of consent, but found themselves in situations where they felt unable to physically remove themselves or believe their reports would not be believed against someone with Pepper's public platform and fan base. These allegations transformed the conversation from being about whether a prank video crossed ethical lines into a broader discussion of Pepper as an alleged serial predator who used both his public content and his private interactions with fans to sexually harass and assault women, with the prank video serving as an illustration of his attitudes toward women's consent and bodily autonomy rather than an isolated incident of poor judgment. YouTube responded to the backlash by removing the offensive video and eventually suspending Pepper's account, though this action came only after significant public pressure and media coverage had made continuing to host his content untenable from a public relations perspective. And critics noted that the platform had allowed Pepper to post increasingly boundary-pushing content for years without intervention, only acting when the controversy became too visible to ignore. In the wake of the allegations and the suspension from YouTube, Pepper faced professional consequences, including being dropped by sponsors, excluded from collaborations with other creators who wanted to distance themselves from the controversy, and seeing his career trajectory fundamentally altered as the accusations and the pattern they suggested made him too controversial for mainstream platforms or brand partnerships. However, Pepper also demonstrated a pattern of attempting comebacks, posting apologies that were widely criticized as insincere or self-serving, creating new accounts when previous ones were banned, and continuing to try to rebuild an audience on various platforms despite the allegations that had been made public and the consensus among much of the YouTube community that his behavior was unacceptable and potentially criminal. The criminal justice response to the allegations against Sam Pepper was minimal, with no charges being filed despite multiple women describing what would legally constitute sexual assault. And this lack of prosecution reflected common challenges in sexual assault cases, including difficulties in gathering physical evidence when victims report assaults days, weeks, or months after they occurred, the he-said-she-said nature of cases that often come down to credibility determinations when there are no witnesses to corroborate either party's account, and the reality that many victims choose not to engage with the criminal justice system because of the trauma of reporting, the low likelihood of successful prosecution, and the public scrutiny and victim blaming that often accompanies sexual assault allegations, particularly when the accused has a public platform and loyal fans willing to attack accusers. In 2016, further allegations emerged when Dottie Martin, a musician who had interacted with Pepper, came forward with detailed accusations that Pepper had raped her, describing a specific incident and the trauma she had experienced both from the assault itself and from the difficulty of being believed and supported when reporting assault by someone with public fame and resources to defend his reputation. And Martin's allegations were corroborated by friends she had told at the time and were detailed enough that they added significant weight to the pattern of behavior multiple women had described. Despite these serious allegations being made public and being covered by news media and YouTube commentary channels, Pepper continued to avoid criminal prosecution and continued attempting to maintain some form of online presence, though his subscriber counts never recovered to their previous levels and his reputation remained permanently damaged in ways that prevented him from achieving the mainstream success that had seemed possible during his peak years. The Sam Pepper case highlighted several systemic issues, including the way YouTube's recommendation algorithms and monetization systems incentivized increasingly extreme and boundary-violating content as creators competed for views and engagement, the platform's reactive rather than proactive approach to policing harmful content as evidenced by their only taking action against Pepper after his content had generated significant controversy, rather than identifying the problematic nature of his videos before they went viral, and the broader cultural context in which prank content normalized harassment and assault as long as it was framed as jokes and entertainment. The case also demonstrated the challenges victims face when their alleged abusers are public figures, as Pepper's fans often attacked and harassed the women who came forward, accused them of lying or seeking attention, and created an environment where reporting became an additional source of trauma on top of the original assaults being described. In subsequent years, Pepper has attempted several comebacks on various platforms including YouTube, TikTok, and others, usually under new account names or by trying to distance himself from the controversy of his past behavior. But these attempts have generally been identified by vigilant internet users who spread awareness of his history and report his accounts to platforms, limiting his ability to rebuild an audience, though not completely preventing him from maintaining some online presence with much smaller and more controversial audiences. The fact that Pepper has never been criminally charged or imprisoned despite multiple detailed allegations of sexual assault, despite video evidence of what appears to be sexual harassment in his prank content, and despite the pattern being public knowledge for years, represents another example of how the YouTube-to-prison pipeline is not inevitable, and how some creators accused of serious misconduct continue to avoid criminal accountability even when their alleged behavior is widely known and has been thoroughly documented in public allegations. Legal experts who have examined the Pepper case have noted that sexual assault prosecutions face inherent challenges, including the high standard of proof required in criminal cases, the difficulty of obtaining evidence beyond victim testimony in cases where assaults occur in private without witnesses, and the reality that prosecutors must make decisions about which cases to pursue based on likelihood of conviction rather than only on whether they believe a crime occurred, meaning that cases that would be difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt may not be charged even when the allegations are credible and serious. The cultural impact of the Sam Pepper controversy extended beyond his individual case to influence how YouTube and viewers approached prank content more broadly. With increased scrutiny of channels that base their content on pranks involving unwitting participants, more awareness of the difference between harmless pranks where all parties can laugh afterward and content that actually constitutes harassment or assault, regardless of whether it's labeled a prank, and platform policy changes that attempted to restrict certain types of prank content, though enforcement remained inconsistent and many similar creators continued operating with minimal interference. Youth education programs and media literacy initiatives have used the Sam Pepper case to discuss consent, the way harmful behavior can be disguised as entertainment, and the importance of recognizing that someone's fame or popularity does not excuse behavior that would be unacceptable in any other context, with the case serving as a clear example of how parasocial relationships can cloud judgment and how fans' desire to defend creators they like can lead them to excuse or minimize serious allegations that they would likely take seriously in other contexts. As of 2025, Sam Pepper exists in a significantly reduced state compared to his peak YouTube fame, without the mainstream success or large platform he once had, but also without having faced criminal prosecution or being registered as a sex offender despite the multiple allegations of sexual assault that have been publicly made and widely reported, serving as a frustrating example to many survivors and advocates of how alleged predators can sometimes avoid legal consequences while still facing significant professional and reputational damage that prevents them from returning to their former level of influence even if they avoid prison entirely. Number 6. Austin McBroom. The sports star accused of deception and assault Austin McBroom built a massive YouTube empire through his channel The ACE Family, which documented his life with wife Catherine Pais and their children, attracting over 18 million subscribers and generating tens of millions of dollars in revenue through a combination of daily vlogs, challenge videos, pranks, lavish displays of wealth, and the carefully curated presentation of an ideal family life that resonated with millions of viewers who tuned in regularly to watch the McBroom's adventures, purchases, relationships, and the growth of their children who became celebrities in their own right before they were old enough to consent to the public exposure that defined their existence. Starting the channel in 2016, Austin leveraged his background as a college basketball player and his marriage to Catherine, who had her own social media following, to create content that emphasized their relationship, their attractive appearance, their expensive lifestyle in Los Angeles, and the aspirational quality of watching beautiful people live luxurious lives while maintaining the accessibility of daily vlogs that made viewers feel like they knew the family personally and were part of their journey. The channel's growth was explosive, with the ACE Family quickly becoming one of the most successful family vlogging operations on YouTube, allowing Austin and Catherine to purchase a mansion, acquire expensive cars, travel extensively, and build a brand that extended beyond YouTube into merchandise, business ventures, and various other income streams, all fueled by the parasocial relationships they cultivated with millions of fans who defended the family against any criticism and participated enthusiastically in the community the McBrooms had created. Behind the carefully edited vlogs and the Instagram perfect images, however, Austin McBroom was allegedly engaging in behavior that would eventually lead to multiple lawsuits, credible accusations of sexual assault, financial scandals, and the eventual collapse of the ACE Family brand in ways that demonstrated the fragility of fame built primarily on image and the consequences when that image proves to be fundamentally at odds with reality. The first major controversies involving Austin emerged not from criminal allegations, but from business dealings that suggested a pattern of financial irresponsibility and potential fraud, including the Social Gloves boxing event that Austin organized in 2021, which promised to pay fighters including YouTube celebrities significant sums but allegedly failed to fully compensate participants, led to multiple lawsuits from fighters who claimed they were not paid agreed-upon amounts, and demonstrated what critics argued was a pattern of Austin making commitments he could not or would not honor while using his platform and credibility to convince others to participate in ventures that ultimately benefited him at others' expense. These business controversies were significant enough to damage Austin's reputation within the YouTube community and led to some viewers beginning to question whether the wealth and success displayed in ACE family vlogs was as legitimate as it was presented. But the more serious allegations that would ultimately destroy Austin's career and lead to criminal investigations involved accusations of sexual assault from multiple women who came forward describing encounters with Austin where he had allegedly forced himself on them sexually without consent, used his fame and physical advantages to overpower their resistance, and demonstrated a pattern of predatory behavior toward women he encountered through his YouTube fame and social circle. In 2021, a model named Tana Mongeau publicly discussed an encounter with Austin McBroom where she alleged he had sexually assaulted her, describing being at a party where Austin was present, being pursued by him despite making clear she was not interested, and ultimately experiencing what she characterized as non-consensual sexual contact that left her shaken and traumatized. And while Mongeau did not file a police report at the time of the alleged incident, her public discussion of the experience prompted other women to come forward with similar allegations describing a pattern where Austin would approach women at parties or events, would not take no for an answer when pursuing sexual encounters, and in several cases allegedly committed sexual assault when women refused his advances or were unable to consent due to intoxication or other factors that legally would make sexual activity non-consensual even if physical force was not used. Additional allegations emerged from women who claimed Austin had sexually assaulted them in various locations including hotel rooms, private residences during parties, and other settings where Austin's fame and physical presence created power dynamics that made resistance difficult and reporting challenging, particularly when weighed against the likelihood that accusers would face harassment from Austin's millions of fans and would be pitted against someone with resources to hire lawyers and public relations professionals to defend his reputation. One particularly detailed allegation came from a woman who filed a lawsuit in 2022 alleging that Austin had sexually assaulted her at a party, that the assault was witnessed by others who did not intervene, and that she had suffered lasting trauma from both the assault itself and the difficulty of seeking accountability when the accused was someone with Austin's level of fame and resources, with the lawsuit seeking damages and representing one of the first times the allegations against Austin moved from social media accusations into formal legal proceedings where evidence would be examined and testimony given under oath. The accumulation of allegations, the business scandals, and the increasingly critical scrutiny of the ACE family's content and lifestyle led to a rapid decline in the channel's popularity and influence, with subscriber counts beginning to fall, sponsorship deals drying up as brands did not want to be associated with the controversies, and Catherine Pais reportedly separating from Austin, though the timeline and details of their relationship status became unclear as they attempted to manage the public relations crisis while also dealing with the legal and financial consequences of Austin's alleged behavior and failed business ventures. YouTube did not ban the ACE family channel despite the serious nature of the allegations against Austin, illustrating the platform's general reluctance to take action against profitable creators unless forced to do so by overwhelming public pressure or clear violations of platform policies, though the channel's ability to generate revenue was significantly diminished as advertisers became reluctant to be associated with content featuring someone facing multiple sexual assault allegations and demonstrated patterns of allegedly fraudulent business practices. In 2023, criminal investigations into Austin McBroom's conduct were reported to be underway, with law enforcement in Los Angeles examining allegations of sexual assault from multiple women and determining whether charges could be brought. Though as of early 2025, no criminal charges have been filed publicly, creating another example of how sexual assault allegations, even when made by multiple independent accusers describing similar patterns of behavior, do not always result in prosecution due to the challenges inherent in these cases, including evidence gathering, witness cooperation, and the high burden of proof required in criminal proceedings. The lack of criminal charges has not prevented Austin from facing significant consequences in other arenas. With the ACE family brand effectively destroyed, his reputation permanently damaged, his business ventures largely failed or controversial, and his ability to monetize content or maintain the luxurious lifestyle that was central to his YouTube persona severely compromised by the combination of legal fees, lost income, failed investments, and the reputational damage that makes new opportunities difficult to secure. Catherine Pais has attempted to distance herself from Austin while also navigating the complicated reality of co-parenting children who have spent their entire lives in the public eye and whose images and lives have been monetized since before they could speak. And the broader implications of the ACE family's rise and fall include renewed discussions about the ethics of family vlogging, the exploitation of children who cannot consent to being made into content, and the way that platforms profit from family content without adequate protections for the children whose childhoods are being broadcast to millions. The allegations against Austin McBroom have been incorporated into educational materials about fame and accountability, about the importance of believing survivors even when their alleged abusers are famous and well-liked, and about the way that wealth and public image can be used to delay or avoid consequences for serious misconduct, though they cannot always prevent the truth from eventually emerging and destroying carefully constructed personas. Legal analysts following the case have noted that even if Austin is never criminally charged, the civil lawsuits, the business failures, the destroyed reputation, and the loss of income and opportunities represent significant consequences that demonstrate how accountability can take multiple forms even when the criminal justice system does not result in arrest and incarceration, though many survivors and advocates argue that civil consequences, while meaningful, are not substitutes for criminal prosecution when the alleged conduct includes serious crimes like sexual assault that should result in criminal accountability regardless of the defendant's fame or resources. The McBroom case has also been examined in discussions of toxic masculinity and entitlement in influencer culture, with Austin's alleged behavior described by psychologists and sociologists as reflecting a belief that his fame and status entitled him to sexual access to women regardless of their consent, that his wealth and influence could insulate him from consequences, and that the rules that apply to ordinary people somehow did not apply to him because of his success and public profile. An attitude that critics argue is endemic to certain corners of influencer culture where fame becomes confused with immunity, and where the constant reinforcement from adoring fans can create dangerous delusions about power and entitlement. As Austin McBroom's once massive empire continues to crumble and his attempts to rebuild his brand largely fail due to the weight of allegations and failed promises, his case serves as a reminder that YouTube fame, while potentially lucrative and influential, can be fragile when built on image rather than substance, and that the consequences of alleged misconduct can include professional destruction and permanent reputational damage, even when they do not include criminal prosecution and imprisonment, leaving alleged perpetrators in a kind of limbo where they are too controversial to succeed in mainstream spaces but not actually incarcerated or formally held accountable through the criminal justice system that many survivors and observers believe should have intervened based on the evidence and allegations that have been made public. Number 7. Colleen Ballinger. The children's entertainer who groomed her fans. Colleen Ballinger created one of YouTube's most successful and seemingly wholesome entertainment empires through her character Miranda Sings, a deliberately talentless and narcissistic singer whose over-the-top persona and comedic musical performances attracted tens of millions of subscribers across multiple channels, spawned a Netflix series, generated sold-out live tours, produced best-selling books, and established Ballinger as one of the platform's most commercially successful creators while building an audience that skewed young, with many of her most devoted fans being children and teenagers who saw Miranda Sings as hilarious entertainment and Colleen herself as a role model and beloved figure who seemed genuinely invested in her fans' lives and well-being. Starting the Miranda Sings character in 2008 as a satire of bad singers on YouTube, Ballinger maintained the persona across hundreds of videos while also creating content on her personal channel where she appeared as herself, discussing her life, her career, her relationships, and her interactions with fans in vlogs that presented her as relatable, kind, and deeply appreciative of the community that had supported her rise from unknown performer to international celebrity whose tours sold out venues around the world and whose merchandise generated millions in revenue from fans eager to own pieces of the Miranda Sings brand. Throughout her career, Ballinger cultivated particularly close relationships with certain fans, often teenagers, who she would interact with extensively on social media, invite to participate in her videos, bring on stage during performances, feature in her vlogs, and in some cases communicate with privately through direct messages, group chats, and even text messages, creating relationships that went far beyond the typical creator-fan dynamic and that involved levels of personal disclosure, intimacy, and access that raised questions about appropriate boundaries between adult creators and minor fans even before specific allegations of grooming emerged. For years, occasional concerns would surface within fan communities about Colleen's relationships with young fans, with some observers noting that her interactions seemed to cross lines that other creators maintained, that she shared personal information with minors that seemed inappropriate, and that some of the teenagers she featured prominently in her content appeared to have relationships with her that were more similar to friendships between peers rather than the professional distance that might be expected between an adult entertainer and child fans. But these concerns were generally dismissed by Bollinger's defenders as jealousy from fans who wanted similar access, misunderstandings of Colleen's naturally friendly personality, or projection of malicious intent onto innocent interactions from a creator who simply cared more about her fans than most YouTubers did. In June 2023, however, these long-simmering concerns exploded into a full-scale scandal when Adam McIntyre, a former fan who had been close with Ballinger during his teenage years, came forward with detailed allegations about the inappropriate nature of their relationship when he was a minor, describing how Colleen had communicated with him extensively beginning when he was 13 years old, had shared intimate details of her personal life including discussions of her sex life and relationships, had sent him personal items including her underwear, had involved him in conflicts with other fans and creators in ways that put him in adult situations he was not equipped to handle, and had created a dynamic where he felt special and chosen but also confused and uncomfortable about the level of intimacy and inappropriate content an adult woman was sharing with a young teenager. McIntyre's allegations were corroborated by screenshots, videos, and other documentation that made clear the extensive nature of his communication with Ballinger and the inappropriate topics that were discussed, and his willingness to speak publicly after years of remaining silent emboldened other former fans to come forward with their own stories of concerning interactions with Colleen, describing a pattern where she would identify young fans, often boys and young men, bring them into increasingly intimate communication and relationships, share personal information that was inappropriate to discuss with minors, and create situations where these teenagers felt both special and trapped, uncertain how to extract themselves from relationships with someone they admired but who was making them increasingly uncomfortable with boundary violations they didn't yet have the life experience to fully recognize as grooming behavior. Additional allegations emerged from former fans describing instances where Colleen had sent inappropriate messages, made sexual jokes or comments to minors, discussed adult topics in group chats that included teenagers, and used her position as a famous adult to create relationships with young fans that served her emotional needs while placing those fans in situations that were developmentally inappropriate and potentially harmful to their well-being, with several former fans describing lasting negative impacts from their interactions with Colleen, including difficulty trusting adults, confusion about appropriate boundaries in relationships, and feelings of having been used and discarded when they aged out of being useful to her or when they began to question the dynamics of their relationships with her. The most disturbing allegations involved claims that Ballinger had created and participated in a group chat with fans that included minors, where sexually explicit content was shared, where Colleen herself had sent messages of a sexual nature, and where the adult-child boundary that should have been firmly maintained was instead completely dissolved in ways that created an environment where young teenagers were exposed to sexual content and adult conversations that constituted a form of sexual exploitation even if no physical contact occurred, with child safety experts who reviewed the documented evidence describing the behavior as textbook grooming that created conditions where minors were normalized to sexual content from a trusted adult in ways that could facilitate further exploitation or that constituted harm in themselves regardless of whether they escalated to physical abuse. As the allegations spread across social media and were covered by news outlets and commentary channels, the response from Bollinger's professional network and the broader YouTube community was swift, with collaborators distancing themselves, planned projects being canceled, her talent agency dropping her as a client, and calls for YouTube to demonetize her channels and for Netflix to address her previous series and any ongoing relationship with the platform, creating professional consequences that reflected the seriousness of the allegations and the documented evidence that made denial implausible even before Colleen issued any public response. When Ballinger did finally respond to the allegations in June 2023, she chose to do so through a video where she sat with a ukulele and sang a song dismissing the allegations as lies from toxic gossip, mocking her accusers, and presenting herself as the victim of a coordinated attack, rather than addressing the specific evidence and allegations with accountability or genuine remorse, and the response was widely condemned as tone-deaf, manipulative, and demonstrating exactly the kind of narcissism and deflection that the Miranda Sings character had satirized, with even some of Bollinger's former defenders expressing disgust at her choice to make light of serious allegations of grooming and exploitation of minors through a comedy song that seemed designed to minimize and dismiss rather than to take responsibility. The ukulele apology video became its own scandal, generating millions of views and widespread mockery and criticism, and ultimately Ballinger deleted the video and issued a written statement that was only marginally more accountable, acknowledging that some of her past behavior with fans had been inappropriate while still maintaining that she had never had bad intentions and that she was sorry for any harm caused, a classic non-apology that focused on intentions rather than impact and that failed to satisfy critics who believed the evidence demonstrated a pattern of knowing exploitation rather than innocent boundary confusion. In the aftermath of the scandal, Bollinger's career entered a state of collapse from which it has not recovered, with her main channels losing hundreds of thousands of subscribers, her touring opportunities evaporating as venues and promoters decided the controversy made her too risky to book, her merchandising and business partnerships ending as companies did not want association with someone accused of grooming minors, and her reputation permanently damaged in ways that made any attempt at comeback implausible given the nature of the allegations and the number of independent corroborating accounts from former fans describing similar patterns of inappropriate behavior. YouTube did not ban Bollinger's channels but did demonetize them, preventing her from earning advertising revenue from her content while allowing the videos to remain online, a decision that satisfied neither those who wanted complete removal of her platform nor those who believed demonetization was insufficient given the allegations of exploitation of the very audience YouTube was still allowing her to reach. The legal implications of Bollinger's conduct have been complicated by the fact that while her behavior was clearly inappropriate and harmful, many of the specific actions, such as sending inappropriate messages to minors or involving them in adult conversations, occupy gray areas in criminal law where prosecution would be challenging even if investigators believed harm had occurred. And as of early 2025, Ballinger has not been criminally charged despite calls from child safety advocates for law enforcement to investigate whether her conduct violated laws regarding corruption of minors, contributing to the delinquency of minors, or other statutes designed to protect children from exploitation by adults. The absence of criminal charges has been frustrating to many of Bollinger's accusers and to advocates who believe the documented evidence demonstrates clear grooming behavior that should result in prosecution. But legal experts have noted that grooming itself is often not a standalone crime but rather a pattern of behavior that facilitates other crimes. And when those other crimes, such as physical sexual abuse, did not occur or cannot be proven, prosecutors may determine that the behavior, while harmful and inappropriate, does not meet the elements of criminal statutes that would allow for successful prosecution, highlighting gaps in how the law addresses psychological manipulation and boundary violations that harm minors even when they don't include physical contact or explicit solicitation of sexual content. The Colleen Ballinger scandal has become a significant case study in discussions about parasocial relationships, appropriate boundaries between creators and fans, and the particular vulnerabilities of child and teenage fans who may not recognize when adult creators are manipulating them or crossing lines that are obvious to outside observers, but can be invisible to young people who are flattered by attention from someone they admire and who have been socialized by internet culture to view close relationships with creators as normal and desirable rather than as potential red flags. Child development experts and therapists who work with young people have used the Ballinger case to educate parents and teenagers about warning signs of inappropriate adult behavior, including adults who seek out private communication with minors, who share personal or sexual information with young people, who create situations where minors feel special or chosen in ways that isolate them from other protective relationships, and who discourage young people from sharing details of their interactions with parents or other adults who might recognize the problematic nature of what's occurring. The case has also renewed discussions about YouTube's responsibility to protect minor users, with critics arguing that the platform's policies and enforcement mechanisms are inadequate to prevent or quickly address situations where creators use their platforms to access and exploit young fans, and that YouTube's financial interest in retaining successful creators can create conflicts of interest where the platform is slow to act against creators generating significant revenue even when concerns about their behavior with minors emerge, only taking decisive action when the public relations costs of an action exceed the financial costs of removing a profitable creator from the platform. Parents of children who were featured in Bollinger's content or who had close relationships with her have expressed feelings of guilt and anger about having allowed or encouraged their children's involvement with someone they trusted because of her family-friendly image and her apparent kindness toward young fans, not recognizing until the allegations emerged that the access and intimacy they had permitted was actually a form of grooming that their children were experiencing. And these parents have become advocates for greater awareness of how predatory behavior can be disguised as mentorship, friendship, or special treatment that makes young people feel valued while actually serving the inappropriate needs of the adult creating those relationships. The long-term impact on Bollinger's victims, many of whom are now adults processing experiences from their teenage years through the lens of understanding they didn't have at the time, includes struggles with trust, questions about whether they bear some responsibility for relationships they participated in even though they were minors and the power dynamics made genuine consent impossible, and the complicated grief of having to reevaluate years of experiences they once cherished as evidence of a special bond with someone they admired into recognition that they were being manipulated and exploited by an adult who should have maintained appropriate boundaries regardless of how willing the teenage fans were to engage in inappropriate relationships. As Colleen Ballinger exists in professional exile, unable to tour, unable to monetize her content effectively, and unable to rehabilitate a reputation destroyed by credible allegations from multiple independent sources describing a years-long pattern of grooming young fans, her case serves as a stark example of how creators who build careers on child-friendly content can betray that trust in the most fundamental ways, how the parasocial relationships endemic to YouTube can be weaponized by those with predatory inclinations, and how the absence of criminal prosecution does not mean an absence of accountability when professional consequences, public condemnation, and the permanent destruction of a career serve as alternative forms of justice even if they cannot fully address the harm caused to the young people who trusted someone who used that trust to serve her own needs rather than to protect the vulnerable minors who believed she cared about them as much as she claimed. Number 8. James Jackson, Onision's former partner. The accomplice who disappeared while Onision's case was discussed earlier in this compilation. The role of his spouse Kai Avereau, whose legal name is Lucas Jackson and who went by the name Lanybot during their time creating YouTube content, deserves specific attention as an example of how some individuals featured prominently on YouTube have faced serious allegations of crimes against minors yet have managed to avoid both criminal prosecution and the kind of public accountability that other creators on this list have experienced, existing instead in a strange limbo where they are neither fully held responsible nor fully exonerated but rather have simply disappeared from public view while investigations that once seemed promising have apparently stalled or concluded without charges being filed. Kai's YouTube career was always intertwined with Onision's, having met Gregory Jackson when Kai was a teenage fan of Onision's content, beginning a relationship that started with online communication when Kai was 16 and Onision was in his mid-20s, eventually marrying and having children together while building a YouTube presence that attracted hundreds of thousands of subscribers interested in Kai's perspectives on gender identity, relationships, parenting, and life with Onision. Though the content was often overshadowed by drama involving Onision's conflicts with other creators and his controversial opinions that generated attention but also made the couple perpetually embroiled in controversy. As allegations emerged about Onision and Kai's household and their relationships with young fans who were brought into their home, Kai's role in these situations became a central focus of accusations from multiple women who described Kai as not merely a passive bystander to Onision's alleged predatory behavior, but as an active participant who helped identify potential victims, established initial contact that seemed less threatening coming from someone closer in age and who presented as more emotionally safe than Onision, built trust and intimacy with young fans before introducing them to situations where Onision would become sexually involved, and in at least one case allegedly sent explicit images to a minor in violation of federal laws regarding production and distribution of child sexual abuse material. The most serious specific allegation against Kai involved Sarah, who has been one of the most vocal accusers against both Onision and Kai, describing how Kai had been the primary point of contact when Sarah was a young teenager, how Kai had developed a close relationship with her through online communication, how Kai had invited her to live in their home ostensibly as a nanny when Sarah was 16, and how once Sarah turned 18, both Kai and Onision had initiated a sexual relationship with her that Sarah described as the culmination of years of grooming where Kai's role had been essential in making her feel safe, trusted, and emotionally invested in the family in ways that made it difficult to resist when the relationship became sexual or to recognize that what was happening was exploitation rather than the genuine connection she had been led to believe she was experiencing. Additionally, Sarah and other sources alleged that Kai had sent nude photographs to Sarah when Sarah was still a minor, potentially constituting production and distribution of child pornography under federal law, and had used various social media and messaging platforms to communicate inappropriately with other minors in ways that, if proven, would constitute serious federal crimes carrying mandatory minimum sentences and the likelihood of decades in federal prison. These allegations led to the FBI investigation mentioned in the earlier discussion of Onision, and when federal agents and local law enforcement executed a search warrant at Onision and Kai's home in August 2020, the specific focus appeared to include investigating whether Kai had violated federal laws regarding sexual exploitation of minors and production of child sexual abuse material, with devices seized during the search presumably being forensically examined for evidence of the communications and images that had been described in the allegations. In the immediate aftermath of the search warrant and the public attention on the investigation, Kai completely ceased all public activity, deleting or privatizing social media accounts, abandoning the YouTube channels that had been a source of income and public identity, and retreating from any form of online presence in ways that suggested either legal advice to remain silent during an ongoing investigation or a recognition that the evidence and allegations made any attempt to maintain a public presence untenable given the seriousness of the accusations and the likelihood that anything Kai said publicly could be used against them in potential criminal proceedings. The years that have passed since the 2020 search warrant without any public announcement of charges against Kai have created a puzzling situation where someone who was at the center of serious allegations involving multiple accusers, where law enforcement apparently took the claims seriously enough to obtain and execute a search warrant, and where the potential charges would include federal crimes that are typically prosecuted aggressively, has nonetheless not been indicted or arrested as far as public records indicate, leaving observers to speculate about what might explain this outcome, including possibilities that the evidence seized during the search did not ultimately prove sufficient to support charges beyond a reasonable doubt, that victims may have been unwilling or unable to cooperate with prosecution in ways necessary to build a strong case, that statute of limitations issues may have precluded charges for some of the alleged conduct, or that investigations of this nature can take far longer than public attention spans maintain and charges could theoretically still be forthcoming, though the likelihood decreases as time passes. Legal analysts who have followed the case have noted that federal prosecution of child exploitation cases typically requires very strong evidence given the serious nature of the charges and the mandatory minimum sentences involved, and that while victim testimony is important, prosecutors usually want corroborating evidence such as the actual images or messages described in allegations, metadata proving when and how they were created and distributed, and forensic examination of devices that can establish the defendant's knowledge and intent, all of which may be complicated if evidence was deleted, if it existed on platforms or devices that are no longer available, or if the forensic examination of seized materials did not reveal what investigators hoped to find. The silence from both law enforcement and from Kai themselves has left the case in a state of unresolved tension, where those who believe the allegations view the absence of charges as yet another example of the justice system failing to protect children and hold predators accountable, while those who maintain skepticism about the allegations or who support Onision and Kai point to the lack of charges as potential vindication or, at least as evidence that the situation is more complicated than the public allegations suggested. Though this interpretation ignores the reality that absence of prosecution does not prove innocence and that many factors unrelated to whether crimes occurred can influence whether charges are ultimately filed. For the survivors who came forward with allegations against Kai and who cooperated with investigations, the lack of visible accountability has been described as devastating and demoralizing, representing years of their lives spent dealing with the aftermath of alleged exploitation, facing public scrutiny and harassment for speaking out, and waiting for a criminal justice system that ultimately has not delivered the prosecution and punishment they believe is warranted by what they experienced and what they provided to investigators. The question of what happened to Kai and where they are now remains largely unanswered in public information, with reports suggesting they remain in Washington state, no longer creating content, no longer maintaining public presence, and presumably attempting to rebuild some kind of life away from the internet fame that once defined their existence, but that became impossible to maintain after the allegations and investigation destroyed any possibility of continuing as a public figure. Kai's disappearance from public life represents a kind of consequence that is neither criminal accountability nor complete escape, but rather a permanent exile from the platforms and communities where they once had hundreds of thousands of followers and generated substantial income, now unable to participate in online spaces without risking immediate recognition and renewed attention to the allegations that have defined how most people who are aware of Kai's existence understand their history and character. The case raises important questions about accomplice liability and how justice systems should handle individuals who allegedly facilitate predatory behavior by more dominant partners, with some observers arguing that Kai deserves compassion as someone who may have been manipulated and controlled by Onision from a young age and groomed into participating in the very kind of behavior that Kai themselves may have first experienced as a victim, while others argue that regardless of how Kai's own victimization may have occurred, the choice to allegedly participate in harming other young people represents a crossing of a line that requires accountability regardless of mitigating factors or sympathetic aspects of Kai's own story. Child safety experts and those who work with survivors of grooming and exploitation have noted that it is not uncommon for individuals who were themselves groomed and abused to later participate in similar behavior toward others, creating cycles of abuse where victimization and perpetration become intertwined in ways that are psychologically complex, but that do not negate the harm caused to subsequent victims who deserve protection and justice regardless of whether their abuser was also once a victim of similar treatment. The role of YouTube and other platforms in Kai's case has been minimal compared to other creators on this list, with Kai's channels simply going dark rather than being banned or demonetized, presumably because Kai chose to abandon them before platform enforcement became necessary, and the relative lack of platform involvement highlights how some creators can simply disappear when controversy becomes too intense, avoiding both platform consequences and apparently criminal consequences while leaving behind victims and unresolved questions about justice and accountability. As of 2025, the status of any investigation into Kai remains unknown to the public, with no announcements of charges but also no definitive statements that investigations have been closed or that Kai has been cleared of wrongdoing, leaving the case in an ambiguous state that satisfies no one and that serves as a frustrating example of how some individuals accused of serious crimes against minors can simply fade from public view without ever facing the kind of clear accountability through prosecution and sentencing that would provide closure to victims and send clear messages about consequences for exploitation of vulnerable young people. Kai's story, intertwined with but distinct from Onision's, represents the complicated reality that YouTube fame can both elevate individuals to positions where they have access and influence that can be abused and can also allow those individuals to retreat from accountability by simply ceasing to be public figures, abandoning the platforms that made them famous and retreating into privacy that makes continued public pressure difficult and that may contribute to law enforcement and prosecutors. Moving on to cases where defendants are more visible and where public interest creates additional pressure for resolution and accountability. Number 9. Tana Mongeau. The chaos creator who avoided consequences. Tana Mongeau built a YouTube career on controversial storytelling, outrageous behavior, and a willingness to share the most chaotic and sometimes disturbing aspects of her life with millions of subscribers who tuned in for what she described as storytime videos recounting wild experiences, questionable decisions, and a lifestyle that seemed designed to generate maximum drama, attention, and engagement regardless of the personal or legal consequences that might result from the behavior she documented and promoted to an audience that skewed young and that often seemed to view Tana's recklessness as aspirational rather than cautionary. Starting her channel in 2015, Tana quickly gained attention for videos with shocking titles and thumbnails promising scandalous stories, and she delivered content that included discussions of underage drinking, drug use, sexual experiences, and various illegal or dangerous behaviors, all presented with a mix of humor, self-awareness, and apparent lack of concern for the message being sent to young viewers who might emulate behavior that Tana herself acknowledged was often stupid, harmful, or illegal, but that she continued to engage in and profit from documenting. Unlike most creators on this list whose inclusion is based on allegations of victimizing others, Tana's path from YouTube fame toward potential criminal consequences has been characterized more by her own reckless behavior, her organization of events that endangered attendees, her promotion of scams and dubious business ventures, and a pattern of conduct that, while perhaps not rising to the level of predatory exploitation of vulnerable individuals, nonetheless demonstrated a disregard for the well-being of her fans and the legal and ethical boundaries that most creators at least attempt to maintain even when falling short. The most significant incident that brought Tana close to serious legal consequences was TanaCon, a convention she organized in 2018 as an alternative to VidCon after she was frustrated with how VidCon had treated her, and which she promoted heavily to her millions of followers with promises of an incredible experience, featured creators, and an event that would be superior to established conventions, convincing thousands of fans, many of them minors, to purchase tickets or VIP packages and to travel to Anaheim, California, expecting the professional, safe, well-organized event that Tana's promotion suggested would be delivered. The reality of TanaCon was a complete disaster that became one of YouTube's most infamous failures, with the event severely oversold beyond the venue's capacity, resulting in thousands of attendees, many of them young teenagers, waiting for hours in extreme heat outside the venue with inadequate water, shade, or information about what was happening, leading to multiple attendees suffering heat exhaustion and requiring medical attention. While those who did get inside found an event that was chaotic, poorly organized, and lacking most of the promised features and creator appearances that had been used to sell tickets. The event was shut down by fire marshals before it even really began due to the dangerous overcrowding and safety violations, leaving thousands of fans who had spent money on tickets and travel with nothing but a miserable experience. Potential health consequences from heat exposure, and the realization that Tana had either incompetently organized an event she was not equipped to manage or had deliberately oversold and underdelivered in ways that constituted potential fraud. In the aftermath of TanaCon, Tana faced multiple lawsuits from attendees seeking refunds and compensation for their expenses and suffering, and there were serious questions about whether criminal charges might be appropriate given that the overcrowding and dangerous conditions created by Tana's decisions had put minors at risk of serious harm, though ultimately no criminal charges were filed despite investigations by local authorities into what had occurred and whether it rose to the level of criminal negligence or fraud. Tana's response to the TanaCon disaster followed a pattern she had established throughout her career of acknowledging mistakes with apparent emotion and promises to do better, posting teary apology videos that seemed sincere in the moment, but then continuing to engage in similar patterns of questionable behavior and poor judgment that suggested the apologies were more about managing public relations crises than about genuine change in character or decision-making. Beyond TanaCon, Tana has been involved in numerous other controversies that raised legal and ethical questions, including promotion of dubious cryptocurrency and NFT projects that her fans invested in based on her endorsement only to lose money when the projects collapsed or proved to be poorly conceived, partnerships with brands and products that were later revealed to be scams or of such poor quality that promoting them to young fans seemed like a betrayal of trust even if it was technically legal, and a general pattern of using her platform to generate income through means that prioritized her short-term financial gain over the well-being or financial interests of the fans who trusted her recommendations. Her personal behavior has also repeatedly crossed into legally questionable territory, including documented instances of underage drinking and drug use that she filmed and posted for her young audience to see, relationships with other YouTubers that involved public drama and allegations of emotional manipulation, and a general lifestyle that seemed designed to push boundaries and generate content regardless of consequences, all while maintaining a fan base that found her chaos entertaining even. As critics argued, she was setting dangerous examples for impressionable viewers and potentially normalizing illegal and harmful behavior. Tana has faced accusations from former friends and associates of being manipulative, of using people for content and then discarding them when they were no longer useful, and of creating situations where others bore the costs or consequences of her decisions while she moved on to the next controversy or project. But these accusations have generally remained in the realm of personal drama and reputation rather than rising to levels that resulted in criminal investigations or charges. The question of why Tana has avoided serious legal consequences despite behavior that has endangered fans, potentially defrauded consumers, and violated various laws regarding underage drinking and drug use likely relates to several factors, including that many of her most problematic behaviors, while harmful and irresponsible, occupy gray areas where prosecution would be challenging or where authorities have limited interest in pursuing cases that would require significant resources for relatively minor charges. that some of the incidents where she might face civil liability have been settled or resolved through refunds and private agreements rather than public legal proceedings, and that the decentralized and online nature of much of her harmful conduct makes jurisdiction and enforcement complicated in ways that allow her to continue operating without facing the kind of concentrated legal pressure that would result if her activities were occurring in a single physical location under clear regulatory authority. Tana's career has continued despite the controversies and near misses with serious consequences, with her channel still active and generating millions of views, though her reputation has been permanently damaged in ways that limit her ability to secure certain types of sponsorships or partnerships that brands reserve for creators with less controversial histories, and she exists in a space where she is famous for being chaotic and problematic rather than for any particular talent or contribution, with her continued relevance dependent on maintaining the drama and controversy that defines her brand even as it creates ongoing risks of eventually crossing a line that results in consequences she cannot simply apologize away. The Tana Mongeau case represents a different type of problematic YouTube creator than most others on this list, someone whose harm to others has been more diffuse and more a result of recklessness and self-interest than calculated predation, but who nonetheless demonstrates how the platform can reward and enable behavior that endangers fans, normalizes illegal conduct to young audiences, and generates profits for both the creator and YouTube itself, despite the negative impacts on vulnerable viewers and event attendees who trust creators to deliver what they promise and to care about their well-being. Child safety advocates and media literacy educators have used Tana's career and specific incidents like TanaCon as case studies in teaching young people to maintain healthy skepticism about online personalities, to recognize that the carefully edited and curated version of creators' lives presented in videos may not reflect reality or may omit crucial context about consequences and behind-the-scenes realities, and to understand that someone being entertaining or seeming relatable does not mean they are trustworthy or that emulating their behavior is wise. YouTube's role in the Tana Mongeau situation has been largely passive, with the platform continuing to host her content, recommend her videos to users interested in similar content, and share in the advertising revenue her views generate, despite the history of harm associated with her brand and the arguably negative impact her content has on young viewers who may not have the judgment to recognize the difference between entertainment and endorsement of genuinely harmful behavior. As Tana continues creating content in 2025, still famous, still controversial, and still apparently avoiding the serious legal consequences that many observers believed would eventually catch up with her after TanaCon or one of her other scandals, her case serves as a reminder that the YouTube-to-prison pipeline that has claimed other creators is not inevitable, that some forms of harmful behavior by creators fall into gaps where they cause real damage but don't result in prosecution, and that the consequences for endangering and betraying fans can sometimes be limited to reputational damage and lost opportunities rather than criminal accountability, leaving a system where luck, resources, and the specific nature of one's misconduct can make the difference between maintaining a career despite serious controversies and facing the prison sentences that have ended the careers and freedom of other creators whose behavior cross different but equally harmful lines. Number 10. Jake Paul, the problem child who danced at the edge. Jake Paul represents perhaps the most complicated case on this list. A creator who has built a massive empire of over 20 million subscribers through a combination of vlogs, pranks, stunts, boxing matches, and constant controversy, who has repeatedly engaged in behavior that endangered others, broke laws, caused public disturbances, and demonstrated a pattern of believing rules did not apply to him, yet who has managed to avoid serious criminal prosecution despite multiple arrests, investigations, and incidents that resulted in other people facing consequences, while Jake himself continued his career with minimal interruption, representing a stark example of how fame, resources, and carefully managed legal representation can often allow wealthy creators to avoid the full weight of accountability that ordinary people would face for similar conduct. Starting his career on Vine before transitioning to YouTube, Jake built his brand on being outrageous, offensive, and willing to do virtually anything for views and attention, moving to Los Angeles and creating content that frequently involved disturbing his neighbors with dangerous stunts, loud parties, and behavior that led to multiple complaints and eventually a lawsuit from neighbors seeking relief from what they described as a living nightmare of constant disturbances, safety hazards, and the feeling that their quiet residential street had been turned into a set for Jake's content without their consent or compensation. The neighbor lawsuit, while eventually settled, represented just the beginning of Jake's legal troubles and brushes with criminal consequences, as his content and behavior continued to escalate in ways that generated views and money but also generated legitimate concerns about public safety and whether someone with Jake's disregard for rules and consequences should be allowed to continue operating without more serious intervention from platforms or law enforcement. In 2017, Jake's Team 10 house, where he lived with other creators and produced content, became the subject of ongoing investigations and complaints about noise violations, fire hazards from stunts involving flames, dangerous driving in residential areas, and a general pattern of treating the neighborhood as his personal playground rather than as a community where other people had rights to peace and safety. And while authorities repeatedly responded to complaints and issued citations, the fines and warnings seemed to have minimal impact on Jake's behavior, since the income he generated from the content he was creating vastly exceeded any penalties he faced for the violations that content required. Jake's pattern of engaging in illegal or dangerous behavior for content continued across the country and eventually internationally, including an incident in 2020 where he was charged with criminal trespass and unlawful assembly after he was filmed inside a mall in Scottsdale, Arizona during protests and riots following the death of George Floyd, with Jake claiming he was there to document the events but prosecutors and critics arguing that his presence and filming contributed to the chaos and that he had illegally entered areas of the mall that had been damaged and looted, though the charges were eventually dismissed after Jake completed a diversion program that allowed him to avoid conviction by performing community service and paying restitution. The Arizona case demonstrated a pattern that would recur throughout Jake's career where initial charges or arrests would generate headlines and suggest he might finally face serious consequences, only for the ultimate resolution to be much less severe than the initial charges suggested. Whether because prosecutors determined they could not prove cases beyond reasonable doubt, because diversion programs allowed first-time offenders to avoid convictions, or because Jake's resources allowed him to hire attorneys who could negotiate favorable outcomes that ordinary defendants might not have been able to secure. In 2020, Jake also faced federal investigation after throwing large parties at his California mansion during COVID-19 lockdowns in violation of health orders designed to prevent disease spread, with FBI agents executing a search warrant at his home as part of an investigation into his activities, though the specific focus of that investigation was never fully disclosed publicly and no charges resulted from whatever evidence was seized, leaving observers to speculate about what the FBI had been investigating and why the investigation apparently did not lead to prosecution. Jake's romantic relationship with fellow YouTuber Tana Mongeau, which many suspected was at least partially staged for content and publicity, ended in separation but also generated allegations from Tana and others about Jake's treatment of partners and his behavior in relationships, though these allegations remained in the realm of personal drama rather than criminal complaints that would trigger law enforcement involvement. More serious allegations against Jake emerged from multiple women who accused him of sexual assault or sexual misconduct, including allegations from TikTok star Justine Paradise, who in 2021 described an incident where Jake had allegedly forced her to perform oral sex despite her clear communication that she did not consent, and from model and influencer Rayleigh Lawley, who made similar allegations about non-consensual sexual contact with Jake. And these allegations painted a picture of someone who used his fame and physical presence to pressure women into sexual situations they had not agreed to and who did not respect consent when it interfered with what he wanted. Though as with many sexual assault allegations against famous men, the cases did not result in criminal charges for reasons that may include the challenges of prosecuting sexual assault cases, possible unwillingness of alleged victims to engage with a criminal process that would be traumatic and public, or determinations by prosecutors that the cases would be difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt. Jake's transition into professional boxing has given him a new avenue for attention and income that is arguably less dependent on the kind of controversial content that created many of his legal issues, though his boxing career has its own controversies, including questions about the legitimacy of some of his opponents and whether his matches are serious athletic competitions or primarily spectacles designed to generate pay-per-view revenue from fans who want to see Jake fight regardless of the quality of competition. But the boxing career has at least not generated the same legal troubles as his earlier YouTube content, since fighting in a ring with rules and regulations is considerably less likely to result in criminal charges than setting furniture on fire in residential neighborhoods or trespassing in riot zones. Jake's younger brother Logan Paul has faced his own controversies, including the infamous Suicide Forest video that nearly destroyed his career. And the Paul brothers together represent a phenomenon where their massive audiences, their ability to generate revenue, and their resources to hire legal and public relations professionals have allowed them to weather controversies and legal issues that might have ended the careers and possibly resulted in incarceration for creators with less fame or fewer resources to navigate the consequences of their actions. Critics of Jake Paul and the broader system that has allowed him to continue profiting despite repeated legal violations and credible allegations of harm argue that his case demonstrates how YouTube and the legal system together fail to adequately protect the public from wealthy creators who treat laws as minor inconveniences and fines as business expenses, continuing to endanger others and violate rules because the profits from doing so exceed any consequences they face, and because their fame creates perverse incentives where even negative attention translates to views and income that reward the very behavior that should be punished. As of 2025, Jake Paul remains free, continues to generate millions in income from boxing and other ventures, has not been convicted of any serious crimes despite the arrests and allegations that have followed him throughout his career, and represents the frustrating reality that some creators can engage in patterns of harmful, illegal, or reckless behavior without ever facing prison time, instead experiencing only temporary setbacks and manageable consequences that do not fundamentally alter their trajectory or their ability to profit from their fame. The fact that Jake Paul does not fit neatly into the YouTuber who went to prison narrative despite arguably deserving to based on his documented behavior highlights how uneven accountability can be, how resources and legal representation can help wealthy defendants avoid convictions that less privileged people would face for similar conduct, and how the combination of fame, money, and a legal system that often struggles to adequately address novel situations created by internet celebrity can result in outcomes where serious misconduct is acknowledged but not seriously punished, leaving victims without justice and sending messages that fame and wealth can insulate people from consequences that would be inevitable for those without such advantages. Jake's case serves as a reminder that this list of YouTubers who went from millions of fans to prison is not exhaustive of YouTubers who engaged in criminal or harmful behavior, but rather represents those whose behavior eventually crossed lines that even their fame and resources could not protect them from, while others like Jake have managed to stay on the legal side of serious prosecution through some combination of luck, skilled legal defense, and choices about which lines to approach but not quite cross in ways that would make prosecution inevitable rather than merely possible.